Hi, I'm Patrick Pacheco for the American Theater Wing. Our subject for today is set design, and our featured guest is David Rockwell, the noted and prolific architect and set designer. There's probably no better place to have this conversation than here at the Public Theater, where David has designed a restaurant space called the Library in what was once New York City's very first public library. So come on in and join us for this edition of Working in the Theater. Renaissance man may be an overused term, but that certainly applies to our main guest for today, David Rockwell. David is a noted architect and designer whose work has included hospitals, public spaces, playgrounds, an airline terminal, and numerous hotels and restaurants around the world. But we're here to talk about David's first love, the theater. That love has been passionately expressed in 14 Broadway shows, including Hairspray, Legally Blonde, Catch Me If You Can, The Normal Heart, and more recently, Lucky Guy and Kinky Boots. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
We're here in a space that you designed, a restaurant in a theater. Tell us a little bit about your sort of inspirations for this theater, for this restaurant.
Well, I was a fan of the public theater long before I knew kind of what the significance of it was. When I first came to New York, I started at college at Syracuse University in '74, and every summer I'd come to New York and was sort of addicted to coming to the public, not knowing what was going to be here, but the energy of the sense of community that happened here, and spontaneously picking something to see. That love for the public continued, and then in 2002 I went on the board. I was on the board for 7 or 8 years and was honored to have a chance to be a part of this amazing organization. When the public was renovating, Oscar Eustis, who had taken over as the lead producer, the artistic director, asked if I would like to do a piece of the renovation. And as we started to look for an opportunity, there was a space. This was originally 25-foot tall open space. So there was no room here. And we talked about what could happen here that in some ways expressed the roots of the public theater as a library and was in some ways an inner sanctum. And that led to sort of creating a space that is a little bit like a kind of smaller, warmer, clubby speakeasy, accessed through a very small door, so we had to make a feature out of that. And have it be a tribute to a lot of the great artists who had worked here, and have it in some ways be a kind of working space that would change based on what's at the public at the moment.
How does the space prepare the patrons for what they're about to see? Often they'll come here, they'll sit down, they'll have a drink, and they're about to go into to see a show. Does that work in this space?
I think it works in a couple of ways, and it's a little bit like I think what designers do is obsessively plan. And then what the world does is say it doesn't work that way, it works this way. And it's one of the things that so fascinates me about work in the theater is understanding more about choreography and movement and understanding there's not only one way to go. So I think this room actually works in many different ways. It works if you're coming from the street and you walk into the lobby, which is now renovated and glorious and white, and you come up the stairs and you enter this smaller space, and I think it prepares you for the scale of the performance spaces. I also think it's a great place to go after the theater and have a chance to rub shoulders and talk about what it is you saw. Because I think what's so energizing for me about theater as a designer, and it's true with public space and with restaurants, is that they're live. They're spontaneous, they're changeable. So, so a lot of what we spend time laying out in a restaurant, banquet locations, everyone wants a corner. You know, it's a kind of translatable conversation to, in the theater, where is the power position on stage? Where does someone might make an entrance? So I guess my greatest joy is melding and mashing up those things. So this room on a very small scale was a chance to do that.
You mentioned community early on, and when I was looking over your work, including numerous off-Broadway shows as well, I noticed that community, storytelling, and emotion seem to me the three main pillars of your work. And community obviously came up in The Normal Heart, which was directed by the former producer of the Public Theater, George
Producer's the right title, I got that.
Yes, it is the right title. George C. Wolfe, with whom you've done many shows, 3 in fact.
Yeah.
And one of the most powerful set designs that you did was for The Normal Heart. It was simple and yet very powerful. How did community and storytelling and emotion figure into that set?
Well, those are 3 of the most significant factors in all of our design. You know, I'm part of what I think of as a robust studio, and everyone's invited to bring their ideas to the table. And at the end of the day, community is what I fell in love with about New York, about working in New York, and a lot of it's accidental community. You know, walking down the street, you imagine the city from the air as this very organized place, but on the ground it's much more messy and vital. And so that sense of community that happens on the street, that happens in theaters, is I would say, incredibly important to me, and it's how I fell in love with design. So as a kid, we moved around a lot. We had a lot of sudden transitions, and building and making things, being part of community theater, as corny as that is, but the making of something that brought people together and created community, even if it was a temporal community, mattered. So on The Normal Heart, what we tried to do was, in some ways, pay tribute to the original 1985 production.
Here at the Public Theater.
Here at the Public Theater, and of course, it was about the AIDS crisis, which didn't have a name then. It was, you know, it was that early on, and there was a sense that the set, in many ways, could be a kind of monument and a tribute to those who were lost, and to those who, you know, were part of that fight and that struggle. And of course, Larry Kramer is such a strong voice, and there's such incredible anger and passion in the play that our feeling was, if we could take the power of words and turn those into texture. So the 3 walls, which never touch the ceiling, so in a way they are a kind of memorial. They're a kind of art installation that doesn't attempt to totally seal off the theater space. And those words are grazed with light, so for a lot of the show, they're texture. They become the very texture of the show, the words that define the crisis at that period. We just made it a very fluid set of pieces that's set within that environment that was built out of the language of the crisis.
The sense of emotions, storytelling, and community particularly, you mentioned earlier, was due in part to your mother, Joanne, who ran a community theater on the Jersey Shore, and took you at the age of 11, I believe, to see Fiddler on the Roof, which was all about community and about Anatevka. When you saw Boris Aronson's designs, how much of an inspiration was that?
Fiddler on the Roof was the first time I remember being knocked out by the combination and the collaboration of music, storytelling, dance, and visual storytelling. You know, and at 11, I didn't know anything about Anatevka or Boris Aronson's work or Chagall at that point, the early references. But I instantly knew from the way people moved and what that world looked like that it was precarious, that the sense of community was defined by the structure in the center. You know, it was a great example for me of being able to contribute to something through visual storytelling. And it certainly, to this day, and I don't know whether you know, but Lisa Aronson, Boris's wife and widow, passed away a week ago at 93 on her 93rd birthday. An incredible woman, and I collect his work, and it became, for me, a real turning point.
Another community that you created with George was in Lucky Guy, by the late Nora Ephron. What are some of the first conversations you had with George about Lucky Guy?
I'm smiling because when we first got into rehearsal, and we first got on stage for the first day of tech, and we set something up, George said, just set it up so I can see what it looks like. And then went, wrong. He said, I'm just practicing. So, you know, George is a very vocal guy, very passionate. We started out by, you know, I read the script. I did a lot of photo research. He drove us for photo research with as many specifics as we could, right? So
this is the 80s now, New York in the 80s.
Mid-80s.
Tabloid world.
Tabloid world, heavy graffiti, you know, kind of a messy Ed Koch period. In some ways, the period of the Normal Heart as well.
Right.
And most of the locations were newsrooms. The Post, the Daily News, Newsday. I set about trying to get as much detailed research of what those newsrooms looked like, knowing that the script was very cinematic in terms of location. So we had to instantly go from one location to another, and we knew it couldn't be bogged down with heavy transitions. So we synthesized it down to a couple of elements. One was the ceiling. There's a kind of grid hung ceiling that is ubiquitous with every newsroom, whether they were smoke-filled, and in the first act in the mid-80s are smoke-filled, and the second act in the mid-90s are not. But that compression was a big decision, and it was something we built many models of, and we played with it as a projection device as well. So it creates a compression, but it also allows us to project onto the ceiling and onto the back wall. And then we talked about how things would be moved and whether they were automated or actor-driven, and it was really George's thought that as much as possible, if the movement of the furniture became a kind of choreography, that it would give it an energy. And so it became, and so we started with very small model pieces in this compressed world with images that represented what the projected content would be. And it was very difficult to make it move at the speed of the play. But that was the goal. You know, that's the design challenge, is to embrace the play as written and to create that kind of swirl of history.
George has directed both dramas and musicals.
Yeah.
Did it help that he had a musical background in terms of how to devise that?
Yeah, absolutely. He thinks musically. He also is able to keep an unbelievable energy in the rehearsal room. And that's a lot of like big guy energy that he had to motivate. And Tom Hanks was and is an incredible leader. So from day one in the rehearsal room, I think we all had a sense that we were doing something significant, and I knew Nora a bit, and she wanted me to do that play. And I think everyone felt like we were, you know, had a chance to do something original, and everyone contributed to the same thing. It's like when a show really works, everyone is telling the exact same story.
Nora had died by the time, I guess, you got into the nitty-gritty of things. Was there a moment when you thought, gosh, I wish she were alive so I could ask her this?
No,
about the set?
No, because my relationship, once something's in production, isn't really with a writer, it's with a director. And I think George felt like, having developed it over such a long period of time with Nora, that he had a good sense of how to do that. And I would say everyone felt like, you know, for a very high visibility new play with a recently passed away major writer and a big star, there was none of that pressure. Part of it was everyone felt like, you know, we all felt like we wanted to do this work, and it had a kind of spontaneity to it.
There's a weightlessness and fluidity that characterizes your work. Things fly in. They're very you know, they have a certain weightlessness to it. And you're all probably also helped by technology and projections. What are the dangers of technology? What do you have to keep your mind on whenever you're looking at something technological in terms of your goals, your immediate emotional goals in creating something for a set?
I think that technology is an incredible tool, and in our architecture, we actually have a small technology lab within Rockwell Group that develops interactive technologies that engage people in space versus separating them. One example of that is in the JetBlue terminal in T5. There's an oval ring that sits over the main public space that greets you when you're leaving or arriving. And it has technology that allows JetBlue to put art installations that react to you in real time, messaging so that's technology in service of a real connection. I think the danger is in falling in love with technology so much that it becomes a kind of crutch. Technology is changed the world. It's changed how kids perceive information, so what their attention span is. In the theater, technology can also lock you into a stage picture that takes so long to undo that it removes any of that fluidity. So, you know, I just think it's a balance.
Getting back to something that you said about the terminal and something that you said in general, is that people like to move around in circles.
Right.
You know, entrances and exits, often on and off the merry-go-round.
Right.
Did that figure in Lucky Guy?
It did. One of the things about the set in Lucky Guy is there is no center upstage entrance. So, and you know, that's a conscious decision because there's an LED wall in that position. So we talked about how people are going to get in and out, and there is a kind of swirl to the way the show moves, starting with the bar, which feels like a very solid environment. And part of the reason that's true is that is, you know, in some ways, that bar is the last remnant of what these old Irish reporters and policemen believe is the world. That's, you know, and as that flies away and the city becomes more of these fragments, but the bar stays on stage. So they can still stay anchored to this thing that makes them feel connected. The desks move in a pattern that's very much like a dance.
There's a Brechtian moment that Nora wrote in, and that was smoke machine comes in, and you see the smoke machine come in, the stagehand comes in with a smoke machine, creates the smoke. Did that dictate, this Brechtian moment, did that dictate your set for Lucky Guy?
No, but one of the things it did is, in reading the script, it calls for a kind of, I think, urban, mid-'80s New York version of Nicholas Nickleby, where there's a sense that the actors are making it themselves. And so that did dictate a lot of the set. That there were, Elaine's is one window and a table. And there are 3 or 4 bars that are real locations. The Lion's Head is an awning, which is the thing people remember the most, although they remember this lion that was in there that we just couldn't find any real images of. So the way it was written did dictate a kind of noir, black and white approach to the work.
And you're dealing with a large cast. Once the cast gets on the set, are there modifications to be made because of the demands of the actors or what the actors want or need, perhaps, once they're on the set and on stage? Yeah,
and what you try and do is have those things built in the rehearsal room so that they can try them, but many, many things changed when they got on stage. In fact, in the case of Lucky Guy, what happened when the actors got on stage is we removed more and more scenery. So the show became lighter and airier. A good example is the restaurant at the end of the first act where McAlery and his lawyer, Eddie Hayes, are having a discussion, and you can see that McAlery is starting to really commit to becoming Jimmy Breslin. It's when he falls in love with that power idea. And we had a beautiful banquet, and on stage it just felt like it wasn't big enough. But you know, a banquet depends on intimacy. You can't make it bigger or it's a barge. So we ultimately got rid of the banquet and did it way downstage with a table, 2 chairs, and a projection piece, and 1 ashtray. And the ashtray, while it's a very small piece, actually defines the center of that picture and gives it a kind of focus.
In the minutes that we have left, just to back up, do you draw?
I
Do
do.
you use the computer? What are the steps that you go through once you have a blank piece of paper, what Sondheim calls the most beautiful thing in the world? What's your first step?
Frank Lloyd Wright used to say, never start drawing until you know what you're going to draw. I don't do that. So I doodle immediately, and I start out with a lot of research. And I do find that directors appreciate, and it's not just research that's linear, like here's the location, but in the case of Kinky Boots, a lot of the research was about other forms of machinery. That if you think about craftsmanship, you want to believe that this factory is a real working place, so all of the set actually physically does something. So we looked at other forms of extreme craftsmanship and how things were put together. So what I'll usually do is get all of that research and sit and start to sketch and try and find, and you have to take many routes to get to it, the engine of the show. What's the physical engine, what's the motor, what's the fabric of it.
David, what's the one bit of advice you would give to anybody who wants to go into set design?
Well, that's such a, if you could only give one piece, it's like, what would you take with you? I would start by seeing everything you can. I would take a sketchbook, which is, I take a sketchbook everywhere I go, see everything, and by the way, it's the same thing I advise kids who want to study restaurant design. When you go to a restaurant, measure the tables, just start to understand those ideas, and then sketch what your response to the play might be. So after you've seen it, it's just an interesting exercise to keep fluid.
Would it be advisable to ask them how they might modify the set, improve it, change it?
Yeah.
In terms of what they've seen?
Yeah, but I think seeing as much as you can, because there's so much great work in New York, on Broadway, off Broadway, fringe theater, and just start doodling and sketching and think about what your response to that play might be. How would it be different?
And emotion is number one? Your emotional response to the show?
I would say it's a combination of emotional and storytelling, because I think that's the world designers live in, is how do you tell that story to have an emotional impact? What changes? What's the transition? And it's compared to architecture, where the physical world can't really change. You're able to create this piece that changes over time.
And that's a frontier that we'll explore in the next segment. But thank you so much for this segment, and look forward to continuing the conversation with two of your collaborators, Jack O'Brien and Jerry Mitchell.
Thanks very much.
We're now joined by director Jack O'Brien and director-choreographer Jerry Mitchell. As a team, Jack and Jerry have worked with David on 3 shows: Hairspray, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, and Catch Me If You Can. Individually, David has worked with Jerry on 2 shows, Legally Blonde and Kinky Boots, and with Jack on the new drama Dead Accounts. Welcome to you both.
Jack is really a choreographer too, usually.
I can dance a little.
Yes, yes, yes.
I can trip that light fantastic. Don't think I can't.
So, gentlemen, tell me, what's the first thing you think of when you hire David?
That I don't have to worry anymore.
Thank God. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's so interesting because I historically, Jerry brought David and me together because they had done Rocky Horror together. And when Hairspray came up, Jerry said, as usually he will with me, I know who we need to have. And I usually say, okay. And we had this wonderful breakfast, the 3 of us.
At coffee shop.
At the coffee shop
Union
on the corner,
Square.
Union Square. And we've never looked back. And, you know, I don't know whether this is apocryphal or not, but if you see it as a job, I think it is a job. If you're dealing with your friends, it's time that you love to be together in which creative things happen. And I think the reason we've all worked together and love to work together over the years is because we always have a great time. This will be the exception today.
It sounds like you're talking about a playful quality that David has. Did that come into play in Hairspray when you were putting it together?
Oh God, yes. Don't you remember we went? Well,
What is that?
we went to.
There's
his
a
house.
cowbell in here.
There's a cow here.
Is that my fault? Are my teeth clattering? What is it? Yes, playful is well, we do play. I
We
mean,
did, yeah. He brought in all the 60s toys. That's how we got the light bright ball.
that's exactly right.
It was a
And
toy.
Necco wafers.
Yeah,
and
Necco
Necco
wafers
wafers.
and yeah, all that stuff.
Talk about Hairspray for a minute, because you recreate, there's a time period called the 60s, but it's the 60s, David, not as the 60s, but 60s with a modern sensibility. How do you locate a certain time and yet not make it specifically that time?
Well, you mentioned the idea of play, and I'm thinking about the first real presentation that we had on Hairspray, where I filled a very big conference room with 20 boards. So I had solved every moment of the show before the first meeting, and I kind of like, so Jack and Jerry came in and they looked around, and I looked at images from the period, and I looked at the kind of innocence I thought of the period. They walked around, they both gave me a hug, and they said, "This is fabulous. Now let's take everything out and let's start with what we need to bring in to tell the story."
Yeah, but those boards, David, that is one of the great things that David does on every show. Is you walk in for your first meeting or your first official meeting at the office, and he's collected so much research. He calls them mood boards, but it can be a whole board can be just on color of the period that you're dealing with. Another board can just be on shoes of the period, which has nothing to do with the way the set is going to be designed, although it might have been Kinky Boots. But literally, it's about the feeling of the piece that you're starting to discover and talk about.
It's a vocabulary thing. It's the
Yeah,
mood.
it becomes the
And
pull.
somebody
You
has
pull from
said,
it.
here's the aquarium in which we are swimming.
Yeah.
Everything in here is game. What do you like?
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't, some of it doesn't make any sense, and sometimes you're galvanized by an image or a silhouette or something that you think, that's it, that's what I feel.
In the case of Hairspray, part of the way we got so far from literal, because when you look at those, if you look at the shows from that period, they're a disappointment based on what your memory is. You know, you have a memory of them of,
Yeah.
and so we didn't want to be literal about it, but there was something about the sense of playfulness, the simplicity of line, the use of color, and
the scale was what was so brilliant.
Well, there's that great bird's eye shot that started the whole show of Tracy Turnblad in bed.
Jerry Mitchell.
Is
I
that,
was
is
actually-
that, is that what it was?
Well,
Called
I
me
was
up
I
in
was
the
bed.
morning.
I was in bed. And
Called
I
me
was
up.
singing the song, Good Morning Baltimore. Mark and Scott had given us CDs of all of the songs, and I would
Demos.
just listen to them over and over and over. And I was in bed, lying in bed, looking at the ceiling, singing Good Morning Baltimore, and I had just woken up, and I went, that's how it starts. She's in bed, and the audience is the ceiling.
And David, then did you take it to the bird's eye perspective? Did
No,
you?
no, he first took it to like almost the bird's eye perspective. I said, no. I said, no, it has to be like that. And then we finally got it right.
and the thing about once we got the angle of it right in Seattle when we did that,
we had to change all the sheets.
we had a very different, we had a more graphic idea. And part of what, you know, I talked earlier about finding the engine or the key idea. I think with Hairspray, we wanted to tell the story from the point of view of Tracy Turnblad. So the bed became simpler. Remember we went out and I had to find all the pink shag carpeting we could find in Seattle. And then the bedroom turned around and became the house, which, you know, gave her a chance to have that piece be hers, not something that was alien to her.
And did the tone of the piece come from your sets, from the music? How did you establish the optimistic tone of the piece? Did it come from Harvey?
You
From
mean
me?
the visual?
Yeah.
From his way of thinking. I remember he sent Jack and I each a big thing of Twizzler licorice, a big package, and a bottle of red wine. And the instructions were first drink the bottle of wine, then lay the licorice out on your bed. This is what I'm thinking of for the curtain.
Yep.
Because the whole curtain was made out of tubing.
7 miles of it.
Tubing. And
Oh,
then it
wow.
lifted to become her bouffant hairdo. Because it was originally going to be hair.
Yeah.
Which ended up being too expensive, and
Yeah.
Margot said,
And
you
also-
gotta
And
cut
too
the
heavy.
price. You
And
gotta
also,
cut the price.
hair
cut the
looked
price,
good in a
cut the price.
quarter-inch model.
Yeah.
The idea of like
But
a
it
It was
40
a
foot.
mohair
The
curtain.
most depressing thing you've ever seen.
That became a Twizzler curtain.
Right, it's terrifying.
But it was what was so beautiful about that curtain also, in the design of it, was it looked like a curtain, and then it turned into the the Inventatorium hair bouffant do with the clip in it. Also, the color behind the red was a blue,
That's
which
right.
made your eye almost, you know that thing, what is it called, murray? When
Moire.
Murray on
Moire,
fabric
yeah.
makes you go like this.
It's a kind of
It
electric.
made that happen. It made that happen. those
And
two
that
surfaces.
curtain also, in some ways, channels a kind of slightly John Waters bizarro version of Lawrence Welk.
Okay,
Yeah,
So the
now, you notice how quiet I am? No, this is true. You have to understand, when we went back and talked about relationships and friendships and stuff, the enthusiasm, the vocabulary that visually leaps between these two men began with Rocky Horror Show. I was brought in to sit at a breakfast table, and for the first 3 weeks of Hairspray, I sat and watched Jerry do the first 4 numbers, because it starts out with 4 numbers. I was catching up for a long time, and still am in a certain way. No, and I don't say this in a defensive way.
No,
It's extraordinary because we do different things with each other, and as a group we do different things. And so basically, I learned, because I'm very mouthy too, have you noticed that? How's it going? I learned basically to watch the electricity leaping between them, let them settle down, and then comment, which has been, until David and I started working by ourselves without Mr. Mouth over there, which is fairly recent. It was a whole different methodology, and it was very helpful to us as a unit, I think. That's all I have to say.
Well, I remember the first time I worked as a director with David without Jack, which was Legally Blonde, and it was very lonely. It was really weird. It was weird because we do have a special, the three of us, a special sort of
we do.
unit, cohesiveness that makes it
Comfort.
Comfort.
and also I think reinforce the best parts. So
Yeah.
I think
Absolutely.
I think there's there's everything's a risk. Who knows what an audience is going to respond to,
Right.
and I think there's a kind of like clarity and confidence about finding the way to tell the story. You asked the question earlier about do things change in previews. I was terrified to go into Seattle, which Jack insisted on we not have the set for the finale, and we had no set.
Yeah. Well, we had a lot of things change from Seattle. One of the things I remember specifically was Motor Mouth's unit
Oh my
was
God.
much more a abstract idea. It was just records.
This big
We
background.
realized we needed something more real.
And I came back to New York and designed that while we were in Seattle.
He sketched it on his piece of paper like he did and showed it to us, and they made that. The Dynamites, which was an interesting story because first time we were in his office, we were looking at those mood boards, and there was no 3 girls singing in the Dynamites. That was not planned until I saw a picture on the wall of a group, and it was a guy in a red jacket and 3 African American girls in red dresses. And I said, what if we got rid of the guy and we had those 3 girls come out of the poster and be sort of the Greek chorus that takes them on the journey? And that's how that number began. We didn't have a bridge in that number.
Nope.
We didn't have a lot of stuff in that number. And then we designed it in Seattle, and it would come on in 1. So the girls were in the poster, and it would truck on in 1. And William had made that beautiful dress with all those little beads. And all you could see were the beads going like this. As the girls were trucking on, I said, oh, that's never going to work. We got to put them in 2. So we put them in 2 behind the wall and revealed them, and suddenly it was magical.
Yeah, that's great.
It was magical.
Although you forget, we had to bring the people in.
Oh, yeah.
That built there's some West Coast thing where they build living versions of paintings.
What is that?
Oh yes, the pageant of the masters.
Yes.
We
I
brought
had-
them
right,
in.
right.
because-
In Laguna Beach.
I
Laguna
had
Beach.
met him. I had met him when I was in the Will Rogers Follies. He came and did the living pictures in the Will Rogers Follies, painted us into the pictures. And so I said to David, we should get this guy to come help us make this really look like they're coming out of the poster. So he worked with us, and we went back to Bill Minchin's shop and rebuilt that whole thing.
When you're directing traffic, obviously the actors, and when you're choreographing, Is that fairly well preset before he makes his design, so that you know this, you need this amount of space in order to choreograph your numbers, or you need this amount of space to get people on and off, or is the set modified as you go along?
No, I don't think that I lead as a director that in any way, shape, or form. We agree on an environment in which we think will solve the problem. Then it's my job to inhabit it at its best, but not to sort of impose my needs on that. That's a different aspect.
And as far as choreography goes, the only thing I need to know before we get into the theater, which we usually decide on before, is how much depth am I going to have for each number. I have a tendency,
And the shape of the floor. You need to know about the
know
floor.
where my space is, but I have a tendency to like to push it all down stage. I don't really enjoy a lot of upstage depth, particularly in a cast size which is less than 30. I like to keep it on the audience's lap, so to speak.
It's one of the reasons why Kinky Boots is that intimate.
Yeah,
Yes,
Kinky is very intimate.
The process of that model was it was much more open, and we kept pushing it smaller and smaller and smaller so that people didn't feel lost.
And Hairspray and Kinky, strangely enough, have a lot of similarities because there are two groups of people. In Hairspray, it was the African-American kids, the Motormouth gang we called them, and then the nicest kids in town. In Kinky Boots, it's the factory workers and Lola's club. And they often work together, but often they also work apart. So you're dealing with half of your cast on stage instead of your whole cast.
David, you started working with Jack and Jerry 2 years into your career, in 2002. What did you learn from them about the craft of making theater? The most important things that you learned from them?
It's a huge list. I learned that it can be an unbelievably joyful experience, perhaps a slightly unreplicatable joyful experience in the case of the success of Hairspray. I remember in the early previews, I didn't know. I thought that's just what it was like. I thought that's what, you know, and they said it's not always like this. I learned a lot about collaboration, which is one of the things in architecture that I think separates us, is we really embrace collaboration and do a lot of projects with other groups, because I think that kind of mashup and having the confidence to do that. So I was working with, you know, two masters who were at the top of their game and really wanted to have fun, and at the same time didn't want anything that wasn't part of that rigorous telling the story. I remember one major lesson I learned. I came back to New York for a few days during Tech, and got all these phone calls that the producer was flipping out for a bunch of, the producers flipped out for a lot of reasons, as producers do. But this one was because we had these towers upstage, where the original concept was the cast was going to hang out on the towers.
Right.
And it turns out that isn't what wanted to happen. So everyone was terrified about what to do
Empty
in New York
towers.
to get rid of the empty towers.
And they
that
were downstage of the Light Bright Wall for the whole show in Seattle until.
So I came out to the
Phone call.
theater and walked the stage with Jack and Jerry, and everyone was panicked, and it looked like an insurmountable thing. And we didn't try and solve it right there.
No.
We had a drink, we talked
We
about
had several
it,
drinks.
And Twizzlers.
and we looked at the pluses and minuses, and it turned out to be not such a complicated physical solution, but it had to come out
Just
of
had to buy a lot of weights.
and figure out the priorities.
Yeah, and we ended up lifting the wall when we could, moving the towers upstage and lowering the wall. So we had to counterweight that wall, which was extremely heavy in its first incarnation,
Right.
because we created that wall. It never existed.
No one ever saw that.
And that was actually an architectural lighting fixture that Ken Posner found that's used for a downlight, with essentially what translated the light bright into that scale was like a Tupperware party. There were these plastic things that we made that went over it. Because when we were playing with this light bright wall, which we would do endlessly in meetings, we realized if you want to say something signals the 60s, in Welcome to the 60s, if we were going to reveal one element that stays with the show the rest of the show, that had to be it.
To what extent does budget play a role when a change like this comes up? Is that why the producers were freaking out, or was it the consideration?
Budget is always there. And I mean, the trick is basically, which way do you want to look at it? From budget up or from ideas down?
And very often the producers, the minute we get excited, which we always do when we're together, they see the dollar signs going up. And they want to say, now remember, no, you can't have any crew, and you can't have any mechanical parts, and you can't have, blah, blah, blah. And you want to say, get the hell out of our faces. The truth of the matter is, we have to dream first. And then we fall in love with things that we are reluctant or will not give up. And then that is incumbent upon our work as collaborators and artists to say, okay, you say I can't have that, watch this. And, I think it was Gielgud who said, theater is the art of compromise. And it is. When you are given everything you want, you know what? It's usually not very good. But when there are restrictions, ultimately, and you are passionately involved with what you're creating, you find a way to make it happen. So we know the budget, like the boogeyman, is always there in the closet, but we don't want to see the boogeyman until we get finished dreaming.
David, coming from the world of architecture, did you have to make adjustments in terms of what money you had to spend on your sets?
No, I wouldn't say. I mean, they're not relative. The one interesting analogy I find, which was an interesting commonality, is in the world of restaurants, and we've done a lot of restaurants. The opening cost is one issue, but the running cost is what really matters. So if there's a chef who's more interested in reviews than running a long time, you can have food costs that are so high that the restaurant can't really survive. So in a restaurant, part of it is, I feel the chef and the designer having a common point of view. And in theater, I found that to be very true. And you have to have your collaborators, your director, your choreographer, be willing to help make a case for what the priorities are. You have to have some courage to say, we'll have this or we won't have that. Or I also find, like architecture, it's about relationships. So it's being able to talk to the shops, figure out what you really need, settle for a little bit less. But you need to have enough of that magic. I think producers flip out because they don't have the language to say, how do we solve all this and still have some magic? And I think that's what our job is, and being able to support each other on doing that is thrilling beyond anything you can imagine.
Jerry and Jack, David comes from a multidisciplinary world. To what extent, you obviously worked with other set designers that didn't have quite that background. Coming from that background, what strengths did you discover in David perhaps that you couldn't have gotten perhaps from another set designer?
Well, quite that background. No one has that background.
Yeah.
I mean, I say this affectionately. Jerry once pulled me aside and said, apropos of this, do you realize that David Rockwell is probably the most famous person we know? Meaning, basically, there are so many fields in which he is revered and loved and probably terribly scared, people scared to death. But you get this world with David's sort of comprehension, which is not just protecting the theater or what's on stage. He, with an architect's eye and with a philosopher's mind, is there with us in the clouds, not just nailing things down, but sort of very often encouraging us to speak first, to find out where maybe our temperature is, where we're going, before he lands anything. And that's very rare, don't you think?
You once said something that I always remember. And one of the reasons I love being in the room with David so much is because of this. He said, if I knew what it was supposed to be before I did it, it wouldn't be any fun. It wouldn't be interesting to create it if I knew what it was I was going to create.
Not knowing the answers.
Not knowing the answers is what makes it so fun to design something with David, because it is sort of a search. It's a mission. You're on the same mission to discover how you're going to visualize this story.
Is it scary?
Well, it's the ideal climate
it's
in
more
everything
exciting.
we do.
It's more exciting.
Absolutely, it's true of
I
it's
think
true of
than
dance.
scary.
It's true
It's
of,
more exciting.
Yeah, when you don't know, and you are holding your hands and jumping together,
It becomes what can we do as opposed to what do we have to do.
That's right.
And David just paints on a very wide.
Yeah, it leaves
Large canvas.
Everything's possible. Everything's possible. That's a fun way to work.
Getting back to Hairspray, you worked with obviously the Courtney Collins show and television in terms of those scenes. Were those difficult to design, David? Was the role of television in that musical, how did that
I don't know about
evolve?
difficult. There was a lot of research that we did on what those looked like backstage, and one of the results of that was the microphone iris.
Yeah. With the lights. With the
lights. And originally we had more thoughts about on-stage equipment and off-stage equipment, but I think there was something very freeing about the Courtney Collins show and that TV world being represented by color, those sort of Necco wafer pieces, and
the sheer curtain, the podium and the stand that we could move anywhere we wanted to, because Jack wanted to put the cameras out in front on the proscenium, so the actors had to look at the different cameras.
They were looking for the
so we didn't have to put the cameras on stage. We made you believe they were out front.
And the Turnblad home became a mobile piece, so they could dance around that.
So the worlds could again sort of dance in the space at the same time.
So by having the minimum amount that we needed to create the TV world, you could meld the worlds more. It became more fluid.
But even the house, I mean, that was one of the great things about the show is as we set up the show, we set up the vocabulary, but as you go back to a scene, you don't have to bring all of the scenery back. The audience knows what you're talking about. So we would bring back just the ironing board and the lamp. Then we would bring back just the TV and the lamp and the phone, whatever was required for that moment to tell a story, because we had already introduced what was the Turnblad home.
The ironing board was like the mother courage. That was like, right? She had that with her at all times.
But it was like moving from a master shot into a close-up.
Yeah.
And once we had established that vocabulary, we had the luxury, because we'd made the statement, we could be selective.
Has that, those shortcuts with the audience evolved as the years have gone on, where you can
We're all in a very interesting, fluid situation, which is highly influenced first by the development of film and film techniques, and now, of course, by the internet. You know, I'm constantly, when I'm asked to do speeches about this, and I talk a lot about Shakespeare because I've had a lot of experience with it. And for instance, talking about a soliloquy. A soliloquy in Shakespeare's time was an actor standing on stage and making a noise like the Metropolitan Opera. They had never heard language like that, and he just stood. It's basically spoken thought, or he's speaking to the audience, whatever choice it is, but there's no action required. Then I keep saying to people, look, go home, turn on a network show, and tap a pencil, turn the volume down, tap a pencil every time the image changes, which means that the ocular nerve is being jerked, and that's candy. And the ear, which is the conduit to the brain, is lagging behind. So we have had to learn, all of us, new techniques for how to make the stage, which is basically static, into something that seems to be moving, because people can no longer listen unless you're constantly changing the venue. And now the internet, even more than that, with people playing, you know, games on their phones and texting and all this sort of stuff. It's changed. We're constantly learning new techniques that have to be appropriated into what we do.
David, how has that, what Jack just referred to, affected your visual palette? And can you apply that to what you may have done on Catch Me If You Can, which was very cinematic? In fact, to all the work that you've done, I think, are based on films as well.
Well, I think the one other factor I would add to that is theater is live and communal. Right, so there is that additional beat where the TV doesn't talk back to you, and the internet, although being the father of a 13-year-old boy and an 11-year-old girl, they do a lot of gaming that is social and communal. But I think in the theater now, there's less patience for, and frankly, both of you had no patience for it on Hairspray when we did Hairspray. None of us were interested in bringing in a curtain and changing the set. That transition that says we're going to do this and we're going to take our time and then we're going to bring up a new world. Those worlds had to weave from one to the other.
Well, also that doesn't happen in the writing. They're used, you know, the old musicals, they used to close the curtain and they'd do the in one number while the scenery was being changed. That's not the way shows are written anymore.
Right.
They're written from one big scene to the next big scene to the next big scene to the next big scene. So you have to discover the vocabulary in your transitions, which, by the way, can make or break a musical if they're not done right.
So Catch Me If You Can, one example of that is Man Inside the Clues, which is a song that takes place in 3 or 4 locations, right? It takes, so we talked about, do we change motels? You don't really need to change motels. You have a TV, you have an element, and then there's signs that we see that come in electrified in different ways against the bandstand, where he actually gets on top of the bandstand at the end of the number. So there's cinematic movement without having to have that heavy bring in the location.
Change the sign, don't change the room.
In terms of tone, and the fact that in Catch Me If You Can, you had both the gritty world and the realistic world and the magical world, those tones that you established. How did sets apply to when you were dealing with the father and the real problems of Frank Abagnale? Did I pronounce? Abagnale, versus the fantasy world that you were creating?
One of the things we wanted to try and do was, that show, more than most shows, was really about the music. So the band is part of the architecture of the show, and part of the concept was he was experiencing this as a TV spectacular. So the challenge became, how do you take away the band when you need it? How do you, so there's a big sheer curtain that comes in that really represents fantasy. But there's also elements of a kind of simple bed, and the bed is something that repeats in different scenes. And as simple as what the end table is, the lamp and the bedding, is radically different in the real world than in the fantasy world. So if you have a repetitive element that you treat in very different ways, I think the audience gets the idea that this is what he's trying to get away from, and that's what he's trying to go to.
And you handle that in Kinky Boots as well. There is the dreary world of the factory.
Dreary factory.
The dreary factory. And then the explosively colorful world of Lola.
Yes.
And
Romantically dreary. Dreary is not the word I would use.
I think it's, yeah, I think
I
it's
thought it
very,
was stunning.
yeah. Well, when we started the design, I knew that I wanted this show, like Hairspray, and like all the shows that Jack and I and David have done, either together or alone, to move quickly and not let. I hate when the audience gets bored watching scenery change. I think David hates that too. So we always are looking for, how do we get to the scene quickly? I knew I wanted a sense of reality in the factory workers, so I didn't want any tracks in the floor because of the Kinky Boots, because I didn't want anybody getting their foot caught in the track, which left us no option for automation in the deck. So, but my real, I think one of my first questions to David was, do you think we can move everything on the stage by the factory workers? Because I believe it will give them purpose in the factory. This is the show where you actually can use them as factory workers, moving the stairs, moving the units, because they are actually there doing the work.
Yeah.
There's a kind of romance to the industrial nature of the show that I think relates to, we were working on a project outside of Philadelphia in Bethlehem, in the old blast furnaces that used to make the steel. And I think there's a romance to the idea of craftsmanship and making that informed the factory. And one of the things we talked about is, through clear story windows and many other devices, walls that opened and closed, in fact platforms that could rotate and light up and become the proscenium, you would have that thrill of believing in this place, and every part of it is part of that kind of romantic industrial architecture.
And once Lola enters the scene, you see those changes in the factory.
Yeah,
don't you?
well, the center office unit, we call it, as it turns, it becomes the pub. As it turns again, a curtain drops, it becomes the club in London where Lola's performing.
It opens up and it's a boxing.
And little rivets light up, and it opens up and becomes the background of the boxing ring.
And you mentioned, David, earlier that Jerry had taken a model to the beach. Yeah, and it's sort of.
Well, we built.
What was the model?
We built
The whole model, the whole show.
We built a
The
very
entire show?
It
detailed.
was all designed by them, yeah.
It was all designed, and each piece. I mean, when you look at that platform, it's 2 pieces, 2 visible stairs, an escape stair, and it can engage the walls in any one of those places.
All the pieces were designed.
Yeah.
And I needed now to sit with it and block the show to make sure I had enough people to make each move, because all of the moves on the deck were going to be done by the factory workers. I spent like 2 weeks with it. You shipped it out to me. And the salt water slowly warped everything. But it was okay.
And was
we were
that
thinking of making the set warped like that because it came back.
And was that sensational conveyor belt number done by that time, choreographed by that time? Did it inspire that number?
The conveyor belt was built. The conveyor belt was
The first one.
It took us probably about 6 to 9 months.
A huge amount of R&D
to create that. Yeah, I had the idea. I asked David to build me one. They built me one. I got on it. I fell to the floor about 6 times.
We looked at available technology before we built one.
Sent it back to the shop. Said I need bars to choreograph and to make sure Equity will let me put actors on it. It was on a dial, so the
Variable
speeds
speed.
were all over the place. I said, this has got to be 2 speeds, one for the shoes, one for the dance. Had the drummer in the room, picked the speed, set it with Stephen Aremus, picked my 2 speeds, sent it back to the shop.
He's
Then
bossy.
He's
very, very bossy.
Then it came back and I said, okay, now I need all of these controls on the unit for the actors, because I'm going to make them be responsible for it. It will be the best way to do it.
We have to. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We could go on all day,
We
but
ha-
I don't think we can.
We have to wrap up.
We
have
do.
to wrap up. I just want to wrap up by saying you've got future projects together. Just one thing that you can say about Houdini on the way to
It's
Houdini.
glorious.
Anything set related about Houdini? that you
No,
can say?
we're in the dreaming part right now. We're beginning to find a vocabulary, and we're beginning to talk to each other about where we could start and what we think we need. But that's actually interesting that you bring it up. Next week we have 2 days together by ourselves, a luxury we've not afforded ourselves yet because we just now know it's going to happen that way. So
Fantastic. And a future collaboration for the two of you?
Oh yeah, we're going to do a new restaurant.
Really?
Mexican restaurant.
Yeah, we're doing a Mexican
El
restaurant.
Parador.
Seriously?
Yeah, with girls in fiesta hats who dance between the courses.
We've got a couple things we're dreaming of.
Yeah.
Sounds fantastic.
listen, in case anybody's interested, I'd like to express in case they're wondering, I'd like to express my gratitude to Elsie the Borden cow, who was underneath this table most of the time, swinging her cowbell. If anyone is, thank you, Elsie. We're very, very good. I just don't want us not to be able to use that in case anybody needs it.
Well, she couldn't possibly upstage any of you. Thank you so much for joining us
Thank
for a
you for
stimulating
having us.
discussion. We want to thank the Public Theater for hosting this edition of Working in the Theater. These programs are brought to you through the Graduate Center of City University of New York and our friends at CUNY TV. I'm Patrick Pacheco. Thanks for joining us.